Welcome in Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm grateful to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss the ongoing fallout from President Trump's tariffs on countries around the world and its economic and political implications. David, thanks always for joining me.
Well, I'm happy. I shouldn't say happy because it's such a dark day, but I'm glad to be with you again.
Indeed. David, there's been an extraordinary market reaction in the past several days. We've seen extraordinary wealth destruction in U.S. equity markets and indeed markets around the world. Why don't I just ask you to start with a reflection on what we've seen play out since we last spoke?
Well, since Donald Trump announced the tariffs on April 2nd, and this figure, of course, is moving around as we speak, but since April 2nd, as I speak, about more than $5 trillion of stock market value has been destroyed.
Yes.
Just Standard & Poor's 500, the biggest 500 companies in the United States. So not the other 30 million companies, not Canadian companies, not British companies, not Japanese companies, just the 500 biggest American companies. More than $5 trillion of wealth destroyed. To put that in context, World War II, adjusted for inflation, cost the United States $4.1 trillion. Wow. And if you look at the decline in the S&P since the market peak in February, that's more than $9 trillion. In other words, 2 World War IIs. And Donald Trump has fought World War II twice. This time, however, the United States seems to be losing.
It's interesting you mentioned World War II because in recent days we've seen a new round of arguments on the part of the administration and people adjacent to it about the rationale for these tariffs, including some references to this is the American version of D-Day. We've been with each other, David, in the past couple of days, and you distinguish between what I might characterize as dumb and even stupider explanations for the tariffs right now. Why don't you just comment on that?
Well, there's a dumb explanation and this explanation that sounds smart but is also dumb. So the dumb explanation is that what the United States has reviewed its situation, and although on the day Trump took office, it was the most dynamic economy in the world that had widened the gap over China to a point where China would never catch up to American GDP, that was an economy of unprecedented size and scale and dynamism and abundance. Despite all of that, yes, it unfortunately no longer made door hinges. And so the dumb argument was, we need to get the door hinge industry back to the United States. We need to make all those little brass things you see in the stores. We need not just to make the iPhones, but the tiny little screws that hold the iPhones together. So that's the dumb argument, because how does that do anybody any good? The smart argument that actually is dumb, or the argument that sounds smart that is dumb, is this is all about capital flows. This is about what has been happening is too much capital has been flowing to the United States. And that has been pushing up the value of the dollar, making American industry less competitive. And what is needed are policies to reduce capital flows and to decrease the value of the dollar and thus make U.S. industry more competitive. So let's understand why that's dumb. How does capital flow to the United States? In 2 main ways. It's there either to invest in American companies, yes, or it's there to buy American government debt. So capital flows to the United States because America is the most attractive place in the world to invest, and capital flows to the United States because America's government debt is the safest investment on the planet. So what kind of person says, well, the problem is our debt is too safe and our investments are too attractive. We need to make our investment less safe and our companies less attractive. That way we'll pull less capital from the Western world, and then we can get, and now we're back at the dumb argument, back into making doorknobs and door hinges again. So, there are people who back the Trump plan who are genuinely stupid, and you can only feel sorry for them. There are people who are craven and cringing, and you can feel contempt for them. But then there are people who make up these crazy arguments, and I think we can be a little angry at them because what is happening here is so harmful. The analogy I compared it to today is like the captain of the vessel, yes, deliberately steered the ship to where the largest iceberg he could find and crashed right into it, snapping the vessel like an egg. And the officers, where there aren't enough lifeboats, are telling everybody, don't worry, an invigorating midnight swim through Arctic waters is just the tonic everybody needs.
I saw that post. Well done. Another argument we've heard from the president himself in the past 24 hours or so is that these tariffs are working, which is to say they are bringing countries to the table to negotiate some type of new arrangement that would ostensibly reduce or even eliminate the bilateral trade deficit that the United States has with these different countries. You're skeptical, David, notwithstanding these claims that 70 countries have already come to the administration in search of a deal. You think that countries around the world are likely to hold out. Why?
Yeah. Well, first, Trump's vision of the problem is not just that the United States has an overall trade deficit with the world. And remember, it has a trade deficit with the world because it is drawing all this capital from the world. It's not a problem that you're so attractive a place to invest. But he insists, looking at the other side of the coin, that therefore the merchandise trade deficit is a big problem.
Yes.
He is worried that the United States doesn't have a trade surplus with each and every country of the world. So not only should it run a trade surplus with the world, and remember, the price of that is capital doesn't flow. Not only should it run a trade surplus with the world, but it should also run a trade surplus with Madagascar. It should be the United States, Madagascar that sells vanilla beans to the United States should be buying, I don't know what, fancy office chairs, whatever. I mean, what is one of the poorest countries in the world going to buy from the United States? It's going to be buying from very low-tech manufacturing countries and paying for them with the vanilla beans it sells to the United States.
Yes.
So that's his diagnosis. He says it's working because he claims the United States is getting all this revenue. That cannot possibly be true. Tariff rates so high do not collect revenue. They prohibit trade. You might as well just ban trade with China. He wanted to be able to say that interest rates were going down, but in fact, interest rates are going up as investors all over the world dump every category of American assets, including treasury bonds. And he says countries are queuing to deal with him. Well, there may be a phone call. Countries pay diplomatic services to keep contact. But the smart play from everybody's point of view, China, European Union, Canada too, is to go slow. Because the pain of these tariffs, Trump's assuming the pain will be greater on the receiving countries than on the United States.
Yes.
And for some countries, Canada and Mexico, that's true. Canada is suffering more than the United States is. Mexico is suffering more than the United States is. But here's the difference. The Canadian electorate knows why they're suffering. They know it's not their government's fault. And they know that the Trump ask is annexation of Canada to the United States. So Canada didn't start this. It's not its fault. It did nothing wrong. And the stakes for Canada are existential. Under those conditions, people will bear quite a lot of hardship.
Yeah.
On the American side, America's more powerful. But they started the war. It's stupid. It's unpopular. It's unjustified. And it has no purpose. No one can explain what it's for. And so while the American people are able to bear more pain collectively than the Canadian people can, they're obviously going to be less willing to bear pain than the Canadian people. And meanwhile, he's fighting a trade war with China, where the Chinese people get no say at all about how much pain they bear. And their government, which is comfortable, can say, you know what, we can stay poor longer than you can. We have a lot of practice. So what governments around the world are going to be doing is saying, you know what, let's postpone this till September. Let's see how Donald Trump behaves when he's at 30% approval rating or heading south. Let's see how America negotiates when unemployment passes 6% and is on its way to 8 and maybe 10 and even incredibly 12. Yeah. Let's see then. Let's see when Americans are both in the middle of a terrible recession and are still paying 7% for mortgage rates. Let's see how they negotiate then. Time is not on Trump's side, and he's done. It's like one of these. It's one of the most self-defeating tactical moves in history. He's put a gun at his own head, and he's actually this is the wrong metaphor because he's pulled the trigger, and then he'd be dead. And he's not. The United States in this case is still wriggling, but he's created a situation where time is on his opponent's side, and he is convincing himself that time is on his side, and that's just not true.
Yeah, what a thoughtful answer, David. There's so many different entry points for a follow-up question. Why don't I start with China? As we speak, we're seeing another round of escalating tariffs between the two countries. Talk a bit about what it means for U.S.-China relations and China's broader place in the world.
Well, the United States has had trouble with China for a decade. It's clearly, since the 2010s, it's been clear that China is evolving unfortunate ways. It's becoming more aggressive, more expansionary, a less congenial trading partner. So 15 years ago, there was an answer to this problem, which is assemble a large group of like-minded nations into a trans-Pacific partnership led by the United States. Canada was a member. It wasn't just Asia-Pacific countries, because Chile was a member, as well as the obvious candidates, Japan, Australia, and so on. Vietnam was going to be a member. I think there were something like 30 countries in the TPP, if I remember right. So get these 30 countries together and say, well, we're going to have a common front to China. And not only that, we're going to write rules amongst ourselves. China ruins every rule-writing negotiation it's in, so we'll leave them out. We will write rules together, the United States, Canada, Chile, Japan, Peru, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam. We'll write rules because we can sort of agree on what those rules should look like. We'll get our tariffs down to zero. And then we're not confronting China in an aggressive sense. We'll say at the end of the process, here's the constitution we've written for trade in the Pacific. Are you in or out? If you're out, it's difficult for you because there are 30 of us. If you're in, these are the rules. You don't get a say. You sign on the dotted line. Trump canceled that in his first couple of weeks in office in 2017. So he made sure that when the United States confronted China, it did so alone. Oh, wait, no, not even alone. It did so under circumstances where it's pushed the Europeans and just about everybody else to being on China's side, because no one wishes the United States well in this unprovoked, crazy confrontation where there is no roundup of allies, where the allies are to suffer as much or more than the Chinese. The United States is intensely isolated while trying to impose its will on the second largest economy in the world.
Yeah. What a lamentable set of circumstances, precisely because, as you say, in an alternative universe, the U.S. administration could have been building a coalition of countries who've increasingly come to reach the conclusion that you just set out, which is that our bet on China's involvement in the global economy hasn't yet paid off. You mentioned the sell-off of treasuries. I want to ask you about that. Talk a bit more, David, about what's behind it and its possible significance.
Well, we talk about, remember the significance is everyone's going to pay more for money. Yeah. So the traditional remedy for a financial crisis, like in 2008, 2009, like during COVID in 2020, is the Federal Reserve and associated banks working in conjunction with the Europeans. There are two big banks and two mid-sized banks in the world that matter: the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, plus the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan. If those four entities are on the same page, their power is enormous. And we saw how successful they were in preventing a global depression during COVID. They also coordinated punishing sanctions on Russia at the beginning of the Russian invasion aimed at taking Kiev in 2022.
Yes.
This time, Trump has created a situation where the other three major banks in the world don't want to cooperate with the Federal Reserve. So what you'd normally expect is that they would together push down their interest rates at the same time, so nobody's currency would appreciate against anybody else's. The currencies would move in level peg. The interest rates would move downward together. You'd create liquidity. If you needed to do quantitative easing, that is extraordinary measures to create new kinds of credit beyond just cutting interest rates, you would do that together. And you would act as with this extraordinary planetary show of force. Well, right now, the United States has to worry. It's acting alone. And the world is saying, we don't want your treasury bills. We are dumping all American assets. So that means declining economy, higher rates, which will intensify the economic crisis. And one more thing needs to be said about this, at the risk of throwing too many thoughts at people too fast.
Please.
When you talk about the alternative universe, keep remembering this point about the capital account and the trade account being the inverse of each other.
Yes.
If Trump truly had wanted to reduce the trade deficit, one way to say is, well, we can reduce, if we're going to reduce the flow of capital into the United States, we don't want to reduce the flow of investment, obviously. But maybe we sell less debt to the rest of the world. That is, if Trump had announced a plan to reduce the U.S. budget deficit, which is, he inherited one that was almost $2 trillion, reduce the budget deficit by 3/4 over the next 7 or 8 years, that would have reduced the purchases of foreign purchases and domestic too of U.S. government debt, and the trade balance would necessarily automatically adjust. You get a smaller trade deficit if you had a smaller budget deficit. Yes. And then your interest rates would go down. This is basically the Clinton policy. of the 1990s. Reduce the budget deficit, reduce the trade deficit at the same time, reduce borrowing costs, and then you get a expansion without inflation. Everybody's happy. Instead, he's launched the United States onto a path of ruin we can hardly even begin to wrap our minds around. I read some economist saying somewhere, no one has ever modeled anything like this because it never occurred to any economist that any country would do anything so stupid.
Yeah. One of the other challenges that banks and others are facing in modeling the macroeconomic effects of this particular episode, David, is the developments that we don't know about. One thing that you said to me yesterday that was both profound yet terribly alarming is a scenario in which in the coming days or weeks we see a fund or a financial institution exposed by this huge market contraction. Why don't you just reflect on that point for our audience?
Well, there's an old financial market saying that when the tide goes out, you see who is swimming naked. So in any up phase, and the markets have been in an up phase since 2022, arguably since the end of COVID, there are people who make bets and they leverage those bets. So they'll make a bet on something and then borrow a lot of money against the bet. And you never know who those people are until the bet goes wrong. When markets turn so suddenly and dramatically and savagely, bets begin to go awry. I think, and there will be a Lehman Brothers, like in 2008, some firm you've heard of, or maybe one you haven't, that just explodes and causes extraordinary damage. And no one knew that the firm wasn't that big, but they'd borrowed 50 times their holdings. And so the impact of what they've done will be very big. I think we may have seen that last night. The Treasury market went crazy between about 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time and about 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And then it calmed down. What looks to have happened is that somebody, not a government, but somebody dumped a lot of Treasury bills at about 11:30. Probably somebody in Asia, just because of the time zones. And so what the hypothesis there is somebody had a bet that went bad and needed to raise cash fast. And so they sold their Treasury bonds fast. And that's what they sold a lot of Treasury bonds very fast. And that's what disrupted the marketplace. Now, mercifully, the dump was big enough to mess up the marketplace, but not big enough to really paralyze it or cause a true crisis. But imagine if that same event happens and somebody bigger is in bigger trouble. That's the thing to look for. Someone dumps a lot of Treasury bills at a long time, can't meet their obligations, and defaults on debt. We saw that in 1997 with the long-term capital management crisis, which nearly ended the Clinton boom early. A lot of that happened in 2008, first with Bear Stearns in the spring of 2008, then with Lehman Brothers in the fall of 2008. And the Lehman Brothers failure was the starting gun to the true financial crisis chapter of that larger story. And I think it's very likely we'll see something like that again. Someone has been swimming naked, the tide's out, and they are leveraged 20, 30, 40, 50 or more to one.
David, in an earlier answer, you said that ultimately resolution runs through American politics. In recent days, we've started to see some Republican politicians challenging President Trump's tariffs. I've been struck, though, we've seen fewer voices in the business community speak out against the tariffs and their short and long-term consequences. Maybe a two-part question. First of all, what do you think explains the lack of pushback from American business leaders? And secondly, why don't you game out how this manifests itself in Washington over the coming weeks and months?
Well, the American business community is very aware of Trump's practice of intensely personal retribution. Look at what he's done to the law firms. If you represented the United States government against Trump's attempted coup, or if you did something else he didn't like, that your firm is he says the government won't do business with you. You can't argue before the U.S. government. These actions are probably illegal. But by the time the law takes its course, the firm's clients have quit and said, we'll go somewhere else. So firm after firm has had to bend the knee to Trump to prevent its clients from walking away, while Trump pressures them in ways that are probably illegal. So the American business community is afraid of that too, especially at a time when businesses are going to need all kinds of special favors from Trump. They need people who are importers, and everybody will need exemptions of various kinds. So they're afraid, and they don't speak out. Yeah. Meanwhile, in Congress, there are some members of the House, some members of the Senate. In the Senate, Tom Tillis from North Carolina and Ted Cruz, to give him credit, from Texas, have spoken out. But to bring this immediate crisis to an end, here's what has to happen. Congress has to find some way to take its tariff power back from the president. That will require a vote in the House, will require a 60 plus vote in the Senate, and it will require a presidential signature. And since Trump won't sign, it requires even bigger majorities to override the president's veto. And that's just not very likely to happen. But even if it were to happen, the message to the world would be, okay, we regret what we did this time. But what the world needs to know is you'll never do it again, because this is an extraordinary breach of trust. The United States this is no longer just Donald Trump acting like a maniac. This is a breach of faith by the United States, which has abrogated its treaty commitments to its North American partners, abrogated other free trade agreements. It has a free trade agreement with South Korea, one with Colombia, one with so many bilateral relationships. And it's part of the World Trade Organization. And that ended its obligations there too. And it's just disregarded every single one of them. So even if the United States says, okay, sorry, that was a mistake, we regret it. Before the world economy goes back to anything like a functioning basis, the world needs to know you've put institutional measures in place so this can't happen again. And that's a much bigger project. It's much harder to unsmash the vase than to smash the vase. Yes. The vase is smashed, and it's not just Trump vase, it's America's vase. And it's going to be a while. And it's going to take some creative leadership and some changes of laws to assure our partners that not only is this episode over, but the potential for the next episode has been safely locked up.
Yeah, well said. Let's wrap up with a final question, David, about Canada. In the meantime, what's your advice to Canadian policymakers in the context of the election campaign? You probably know that Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, the two people most likely to be prime minister when the election is over, have committed to entering into bilateral negotiations on what's being characterized as an economic and security agreement, ostensibly something more comprehensive than our current trade agreement. What would be your advice for whomever is at the table in those eventual negotiations?
I'm going to give some kind of cynical advice. So Canada should enter into negotiations, because while you're negotiating, that seems to stop Trump from breaking anything more. But it should not hurry. You want these negotiations to go slow, because the pain is accumulating on the United States. And again, Canadians understand this is not of their doing, and that the Trump's ask is the abolition of Canada. So Canadians will understand, even if there are tough times ahead for Canada, Canada didn't start the war, Canada didn't want the war, Canada didn't make the war, Canada would end the war as soon as it could. But the stakes for Canada are the existence of Canada, so it can't afford to lose. The Americans did start the war. It is their fault. They don't have an ask, and the stakes for them are just being an obnoxious jerk, and that's an easy thing not to do anymore. So go slow, let the pain accumulate, be conscious, work with other allies that their negotiations also go slow. And then I'll endorse two things you've said to me in private. One is don't impose a lot of retaliatory tariffs. That just causes pain to Canadians for no good reason. Instead, use selective export taxes. Put an export tax on potash. Put an export tax on electricity. Put an export tax even on although export taxes on oil, oil's heading to, giving it away for nothing. Trump's wrecked that market too. But export taxes on other forms of energy, maybe natural gas. Selective export taxes, not a lot of import taxes. That's your idea, which I credit you for. You've also made the point that Canadian provincial government should set up funds. This is a brilliant idea of yours, to go poaching American talent. All those people fired from the National Institutes for Health, yes. All the people who want to work on vaccines in a country that says magic amulets and incantations are the way we'll treat infectious disease. Each premier put together a fund and say, life in British Columbia is pretty nice. You've got here we'll give you a 20-year contract to bring your whole lab to Canada, poach talent where you can. And then constant education of public opinion. Yeah. So the Canadians know why this is happening and that it wasn't their government's fault. And then I will endorse my own last idea. It's kind of mischievous, but I think Canada should waive sales taxes on show of a U.S. passport. So if Americans feel the need for a Nintendo set at world prices, I mean, Canada's obviously not going to engage in smuggling itself, but why should Canada help the Americans punish freedom-loving Americans for wanting to buy Nintendos or Nike shoes at the fair price? So if they want to come to Canada and buy Nikes or Nintendos or anything else, coffee, cinnamon, show your American passport, no sales tax for you.
Yeah, I've been thinking more and more about that proposal just as we wrap up, David. And one of the things that makes it so clever is, of course, the president and others around him have at various points asserted that Canada's value-added tax is actually a tariff. And so this would be an instance of
Yes, exactly.
of essentially conceding the point and offering relief to Americans. Those are precisely the brilliant ideas that our audience.
Well, two of them are yours. Those two of them were yours. The two best ones.
Every week, I want to thank you for joining me, David, and I look forward to catching up next week.
Bye-bye.